It gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Vibha Krishnamurthy, who is an old friend and colleague. She studied developmental pediatrics from Boston Children's Hospital and came back to India in 2001. And she set up one of the leading child development centers called UNIC. Since then, she has done some pioneering work over the last 25 years. She's been an outstanding clinician, she's been a researcher, an academician, and above all, an advocate for children. The topic for today's keynote address is caring for the caregiver, parent mental health and its impact on child development. This is an area which is very close to Vibha's heart. She's authored many books, and one of the outstanding ones was Nurturing Care for Early Childhood Development, which was published by the UNICEF Foundation. Dr. Krishnamurthy.
Good morning, everyone, and what a pleasure to be here. Many thanks to the foundation for organizing a conference on such an important topic, and I'm so excited to be here. Thank you, Mahesh, for that warm introduction, and it's always good to get a good friend to introduce you. He always says nice things about you. So I want to begin today with talking a little bit about this little baby that you see here. Maybe we can dim the lights over that so we can see the slide better. So when you see this baby here, I just was wondering if you could give me some words to tell me what comes to your mind. What kind of adjectives come to your mind when you see this baby? Happy. Anything else? Smiling. Yeah, sure. Satisfied. Sorry? Bright. Yeah. Curious. I love that. What else? Thinker.
And enthusiastic.
Sorry? Enthusiastic. Yeah. Sorry? Dreaming. Okay. And it's so wonderful to hear all these words. And clearly you were all influenced by Anne's wonderful talk. And indeed, those are the adjectives we want for all little ones that we see in our preschools and we see in our homes, right? We want them to be happy, we want them to be creative, we want them to be enthusiastic, dreamers, curious, all those adjectives we want to apply. The question is, how do we make sure that all the little ones that we see, all the young children that we see, have an opportunity to become those things that we want for them? In other words, in the first 3 years, what does a child's brain need? Going back a little bit, I think Mr. Basu spoke about how important the first few years of a child's life are. What's interesting is that in the first 3 years of life, the brain reaches 80% of its adult weight. We know that. But the development continues lifelong. We can still learn. Good news, right? That's why we're all here today. But the other thing we want to know is how exactly does that happen? We know that the child's brain in the first 3 years of life, what is unique, is that it is exquisitely sensitive to the environment, to the things around it. And therefore, we need to know what are the things we need to keep in mind in the first 3 years that the baby needs. So 3 years, 3 things. Okay. The first 2 are not hard to imagine. The first thing that the brain needs is good health and nutrition, right? If you're sick, if you're hungry, if you're not got the right kind of food, your brain cannot grow and develop. The second thing is also pretty intuitive. The child needs to feel safe, right? If you are not safe physically and emotionally, if you're experiencing violence, whether it is in the home or whether it's because you're in a war-torn country, your brain cannot develop to its optimal capacity. These are the first 2 things. What I'm here to talk about today is the third thing, and that is responsive caregiving. In this talk, actually, I'm going to be using the word caregivers and caregiving interchangeably with parents and parenting. And that is to acknowledge here that many times caregivers are not the parents. It could be grandparents, it could be nannies, it could be aunts and uncles, but I will use them interchangeably. And I want to talk a minute about what is responsive caregiving. By the way, these three things I've told you are in the WHO's Nurturing Care Framework, which I was one of the authors, not the author, that Mahesh was talking about. And the Nurturing Care Framework actually calls out three things that are important for child development, emphasizing one of the things, it calls out five, but there are three categories. One of them is responsive caregiving. And what exactly do we mean by that? What do we mean by responsive caregiving? In order to understand that, we need to know how the child's brain develops. So let's look at the science behind it. The first thing we need to know is the child's brain is not an empty box, right? We cannot stuff things in it. One of the pet peeves is the phrase, your child's brain is like a sponge. Okay? And sponge, the reason being, the sponge is a passive thing. It just kind of absorbs things. But the child's brain is actually not passive at all. It is active, teeming with neuronal connections. In the first few months of life, there are millions and millions of neuronal connections being made. And when I say neurons, I'm talking about the cells in the brain that make connections. They have little things that stick out and make connections one to the other. And this is happening in a very active process. It is not passive at all. And what we know is that a one-way direction of flow does not work for brain development. You need a two-way process. This means that the child's brain is actually like a game that responds some kind of turntable, right? Like table tennis, like tennis, there's serve, there's return. Like cricket, there's bowling and someone bats back, right? It goes back and forth, and with each back and forth, you have a connection being made. So what does this look like? When you see this mother going back and forth, what do you suppose she's saying to her, right? She's changing the diaper of her baby. She's saying, hello there, who's a good girl who's going to get her diaper changed? And the baby looks and she goes, oh. Right. And the mother responds to her saying, that's right, that's you. And then the baby goes, again. Right? And if the mother stops, the baby serves and goes, and reaches out and she says, oh, you want me to do it quickly. Right? So with each one of these back and forth interactions, here's what's happening in the baby's brain. See those lit up portions where the two nerve endings are connecting to each other and making that magical connection that allows the baby to learn that when I make the sound, my mom responds to me. When my mom makes that sound, I respond to her. There you have language development in the first 3 months of life already. So this is what is the responsive part of parenting or caregiving, that you reach out to the baby and the baby reaches out back to you. What this requires actually is again 3 things, right? The number 3 is going to come up often. For you as a parent, it requires that you observe the baby. Number 1 is observation. Right? Is my baby, what's the baby doing? Is the baby making a sound? Is the baby looking a certain way? Is she moving her limbs in a certain way? Right? The second part of that is to interpret that. Is she hungry? Is she bored? Is she ready for the next mouthful or not? Right? Does she want to be changed? Does she want to be picked up? Does she need to be soothed? Right? So you are interpreting instinctively. And the third is responding. Responding promptly, with warmth, and consistently. Not only when you are looking away from your phone or only when you're not busy doing other things. You're responding promptly, warmly, and consistently to each time your child makes an overture. That is responsive parenting. So let's look at what that looks like. In this video, you're going to see a mother playing peekaboo with her child. Peekaboo is a game that exists in every culture. right? And it is, it's promoting object permanence for those of you who are interested in, those aspects of child development. And what you see in this video is not just two loving parents playing with a child. You see a mom who's playing peekaboo with a child, but notice how she's observing the baby. The next step in the game, she initiates only when the baby shows her that she is ready for the next step, right? She doesn't look. She doesn't just do that. She waits for the baby to respond and then she responds. Let's watch. So you saw that, right? When the baby is reaching out and is ready and is showing through her facial expression and gestures that she's ready for the next step, the mom then takes the cloth up again, the dupatta up again, and then plays with her, right? So that was responsive parenting in action. And we see this day in and day out, and we think this is so intuitive, every parent knows that. Of course it's natural, right? But let's shift gears for a minute. Let's move away from the baby's brain development and think about the parent. The thing is, when a child is born, there's someone else who's being born to. A parent is being born. How many of you here are parents? So many of you. And each one of you, I'm sure, remembers the first few days, the first few weeks, the first few months after you became a new parent. Right? Of course, there is the joy and the excitement of having a new baby. But what else has happened? Anyone? Responsibilities. What else?
Transformation.
Sorry?
A lot of change, a lot of
Lack of
transformation.
sleep. Absolutely. You're exhausted, right? What else do you remember? Overwhelmed. Anxious, right? So many things are going on in a new parent's life. It is the beginning of parenting, but it's also the loss of your life as a single carefree person or a couple with plenty of time for each other. Maybe there are now financial burdens. There is loss of sleep. There is loss of adult company. Right? There's sort of the mind-numbing routine of changing and feeding and changing and feeding, right? You feel overwhelmed, you're exhausted. And many times we don't acknowledge that for many people, this tips over into parental depression. Not everybody. So 50 to 85% of parents, especially mothers, experience some form of what we call the baby blues. But in a smaller percentage of them, about 15% of those, it becomes postpartum depression. And it is much more common than we imagine. And depression, by the way, is not just feeling sad. Postpartum depression or any form of parent depression takes over your life. Right? After those first few weeks, many people pick themselves up, but many people do not. What many people find is that they're feeling not just sad and low, but also they lose sleep. They're not as hungry as they used to be. There's a general sense of just feeling tired and numb and feeling like you're moving through passes, like you're moving through something that doesn't seem right. There's a fog. And it's really hard because this is all in the context of wanting to be there for your baby. It's in the context of people expecting you to be a certain way. It's the social expectation that now your life is complete, that as a parent you should be joyous and fulfilled. So there's the guilt about not feeling happy that you are happy to have a baby. Right? So there is all these things that you experience, and I think that we talked about how the fact that it is common. At least 1 in 10 parents actually have experienced this. And we have statistics for India itself, which is that 1 in 5, 22% to be precise, women experience postpartum depression. That is an incredibly common occurrence, right? So in this hall full of many, many parents that we see, we have certainly the equivalent of 2 tablespoons of people who have actually not just experienced depression postpartum, but also experienced the shame that goes along with it. The thought that, oh my gosh, look at me, I'm not happy about being a parent. I can't be there for my baby. I can't play with my baby the way that mother was playing with her baby. And you see other parents around you playing with your baby. And by the way, this is common in fathers too. Fathers are no exception to this, and it impacts every aspect of their lives, just as it impacts for the mothers. So it's really interesting to see that we don't talk about this. If anything else were this common, we'd all be talking about it, and yet this is not acknowledged, and this is not something that all of us speak about. I want to show you a little bit of what happens when a parent is depressed and unable to be the kind of responsive parent that we were talking about. Right? So when you are feeling depressed, low, sad, low energy, what happens to the baby? What happens in the baby's brain? Let's take a look. So what I'm about to show you is an experiment that was done many decades ago, actually, by Dr. Ed Tronick, who is a researcher in Boston, right, at UMass and Harvard. And what he showed was an experiment where a mother comes in with a baby, and the baby, engages with the mother's very responsive, and then the researchers asked the mother to have a flat face, not respond to the baby, not be responsive to the baby's overtures, sounds, smiles, pointing. And you notice how very distressed this baby gets. It's actually a very difficult video to watch. I'll show you.
In this still phase experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby who's about a year of age. And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her. This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this. And then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, "Come on, why aren't we doing this?" Even in this 2 minutes when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it, they actually lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
I'm here. And what are you doing? Oh, yes. Oh, good.
So what you saw there was how distressed within a minute. That whole process was actually less than a minute of how the mother stops responding to the baby. And how distressed physically and emotionally the baby gets when the mother does not respond to her overtures and to her reaching out. Occasionally this happens to everybody, and you could see that after a minute when the mother went back and she started reaching out to the baby and she engaged with the baby was back and it was okay. But if this happens over and over again, over days, weeks and months, right, of course it affects those connections that we saw when the mother and baby are responsive, or the parent and the baby are responding to each other. It disrupts the baby's brain architecture. It does not allow those connections to form, and it does affect their learning. So there was a recent study that was out from Canada, which had 52,000 preschoolers they studied. And out of those 52,000 preschoolers, 1 in 5 mothers, 20% again, nearly 20%, 19% of those, their mothers had maternal depression. What they looked at was whether these preschoolers were at risk for learning difficulties. And the answer was a big yes. They were 17% more likely, if they had a mother who had experienced depression in the first 5 years of life, to have difficulties, particularly in the social realm and in the emotional realm. So getting along with other children, playing with other children, following classroom directions, executive functions, planning, organizing, those kinds of things were significantly affected in these children. So this is something for all of us as educators to keep in mind, what a significant impact this has on children, child learning. So then,
And there's still phases.
now that we know about this, what are we going to do about it? As people who work with children, as people who work with families, the question really is, what is our responsibility? The first thing we know is prevention is actually a thing. It's possible. Depression and feeling overwhelmed, anxious, low, depressed is much more common if you have risk factors, actually, right? The higher, the lower you go in socioeconomic strata, the poorer you get, the more likely you are to see parental depression. This is data behind this. If you are a single parent, if you are overwhelmed financially, if you have chronic illness, all the other risk factors which add to stress and overwhelm are all factors which will increase the chances of parental depression. So one of the things that we can do as care providers is make sure that we address some of these. Right? We learned very important lessons during the pandemic. There was a situation where all parents were stressed, anxious, and depressed. Perhaps not depressed, but certainly stressed and anxious. So Ummeed, the organization, the not-for-profit that I work with, works a lot with low-income communities, particularly in urban slums and rural areas. And when we told our community health workers to go and talk about child development during the pandemic, they looked at us as though we were crazy. They said, क्या बोल रहे हैं दीदी, लोगों को खाने के लिए चीज नहीं है, पैसे नहीं है कुछ खरीदने के लिए, और हम बाल विकास के बारे में कैसे बात करेंगे? Right? So we had to hear them. And what we told them was, first let's step back. We have to first look after the care providers, right? Just as teachers, just as we want parents to be engaging with their children and be happy and cheerful around their children, in order to do that, we need to take care of parents. Move back a step. We then need to take care of teachers, doctors, and community health workers and make sure that we are in a good space mentally, right? So we need to talk about teacher mental health and community health worker mental health if we are going to talk about parent mental health too. So we organize platforms for community health workers to talk about their own experiences, their own distress and anguish during the pandemic. And then what we learned from there, we asked them to apply to parents and organize groups of parents where they could talk about little ways in which they were taking care of each other and of themselves. So I want to show you one such thing that we created. It was a little booklet that one of our therapists worked with a group of parents of children with disabilities, and the parents created a booklet that they wanted to share with other parents. And here's what they wanted to call it. Jugaad, right? Indians are good at Jugaad. For those of you who don't know, Jugaad means a life hack, a trick, a life skill that you know, that to take care of things when the systems don't work. And what parents said is that we may not have access to psychiatrists or therapists, but we have our Jugaad. Right? And here's what they called their Jugaad. One of the things they spoke about was having friends, conversation with friends about what matters to us. And sometimes having a good cry was also one of their Jugaad. Listening to favorite songs, music, hanging out on the balcony, waving to other people while listening to the songs, making fun videos on TikTok, and sometimes playing board games like Ludo within the family. They talked about physical exercise, and there is actual data about this. Things like going for a brisk walk, dancing, stretching, yoga, All these were things that they talked about that improved their own mental health. Interestingly, they spoke about the healing value of nature. I think what I was moved by in Anne's video was how engaged children are with nature. And it is so for us as all individuals. All of us adults need nature to feel healed. And you might ask, where is the nature in an urban slum? We have trees around us. They have plants around them. And looking at plants, looking at flowers also brought healing to a lot of these families. And we invited other families to add to this document. They called it a living document and said we all have life hacks that we can use to support each other and ourselves. But let's make no mistake, we do need early intervention when we actually diagnose, when we actually recognize maternal depression. There are questionnaires, very simple ones, that can identify parental depression, right? And I described some of the symptoms. The fact is, the eye does not see what the mind does not know. Now that we all know about parental depression, I invite you to reach out to other school teachers or other people who engage with families and look for some of these things. Ask that question. Very often parents are waiting for someone to ask them that question about how is their mental health. And when you see the signs, you have to act early. If you have access to a psychiatrist, you have access to a therapist, wonderful. Then we actually have medications and forms of therapy that can support parents. If you don't, at the very least, we can mitigate risk factors that we just spoke about. The interesting thing is just treating for depression is not enough for a parent-child interaction. Very often, the parents need to learn how to engage with their child in a responsive way. So they may actually need coaching for how to engage with their child interactively, even while they're being treated for depression. So with that, I'll end with the wonderful musician Rafi's quote. When you pay attention to the beginning of a story, you can change the whole story. So if we pay attention to the beginning of the parenting journey, we can indeed change a child's life. Thank you.